Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Welcome. My name's Sarah Green. I'm the program manager for Barnard Teaches. First, I'm going to introduce Barnard Teaches to everyone. Then you'll hear from the panel, including a presentation from a former student. And finally, we hope to have 10 minutes for questions after our discussion. So we'll begin with a presentation. The past, present, and future of Barnard Teaches. What is Barnard Teaches? It's a series of 8 courses made possible by a grant from the Mellon Foundation. It connects the college to major New York City institutions, grants students access to curators, archivists, and collections, and supports innovative, digitally minded pedagogy. Each course has place-based learning and digital components. That means students learn on-site at New York City institutions. Digital components of the course enhance and enrich the learning experience, and collaborations between faculty, curators, archivists, and digital innovators create new points of access to share and learn information. Barnard Teaches is in its 8th year and final year, and campus has changed a lot since we started. Most recently, this change was driven by adapting to the pandemic, but when the grant was awarded, we had less support for digitally minded pedagogy. Today, we have a robust system housed in the Milstein Center and beyond. Our partners, so each course grants students access to New York City-based institutions. For example, our students toured the herbarium at the New York Botanical Garden and examined rare texts at their Mertz Library. They examined historical maps that were hand-selected by the map division at the New York Public Library. And students were also guided by curators through the Brooklyn Museum's Inuit art collection. Students were also eligible to apply for selective internships, summer internships with curators and archivists that they met in class. The courses, so we had 8 courses in 8 years across 7 departments. There's too much information to share in such a short time, so I'll briefly go through the courses taught by faculty who aren't here today at the panel. First is The Worlds of Enzaki Shange, taught by Kim Hall, in which students explored the world of the Enzaki Shange, speaking to the artist herself while guided by archivists at the Schomburg Center and the Barnard Archives. Students created a digital archive ranging from podcasts to art pieces. And then in A Virtual Enlightenment by Anne Igane, curators at the Met guided students through 18th century period rooms. In digital projects, students brought new life to each space, virtually adding context to the rooms and making the spaces accessible beyond the walls of the museum. In Digital Footprints by Paul Scolari, students worked with archives and library teams at the Jerome Robbins Dance Division to research dance and choreography. Students then made multimedia projects juxtaposing annotated text with visual archival material. In New York City's Gilded Ages by Kimberly Johnson and Meredith Lynn, students compared the first Gilded and second Gilded Ages, utilizing archives at the New York Historical Society and handling objects from their collection with curators. Final projects compared the past with today's increasing economic inequality. So we'll be hearing from the faculty who are highlighted in orange here. So I'll just speak about Hannah Worthen's course, since she's not on the panel today, but she's present in the audience. Ecologies of Transmedia Performance is a course that worked with a curator from the Billy Rose Theater Division who introduced students to archival material on the Hippodrome Theater and Rosie the Elephant, and co-taught digital skills which students use to create their own transmedia projects. So now I'll break a bit and I'll introduce Laura Boschak, who is a former student who's also on the panel, and now she's here to present her work. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to share my screen now. So the project I worked on during the internship was called The Changing Shoreline of New York City, which I collaborated with Bert Spann as part of the environmental visualizations class. And working with him, I learned about the digitized map collections of the New York Public Library and a number of projects that Bert was working on for the library and its digital platforms. It was a great opportunity to work with him and the library and learn about map making using free and available software like QGIS. This is a little bit of information about Bert. I was mostly using the space-time directory that Bert developed, which was an amazing tool for me to explore and use for my own project. It included historical maps of New York City organized by decade, links to historical photographs, as well as crowdsourced georeferencing projects and open source data, tutorials, and web building information. The final project that I developed with Bert, featured on the directory, was an interactive website that basically highlighted a collection of different shoreline conditions in New York City and how they have changed over time due to industrialization and expansion on the island. So here's what the intro page looks like with the shorelines of interest outlined. And as you scroll, the map would zoom into these areas, and there would be text that explained the historical significance of the site, the reshaping of the landscape over time, and the broader changes in the city that were taking place, as well as historical images from the archives and map overlay that would change opacity and would link to the New York Public Library collections for high-res downloads and information about its source. This interest in the shoreline then kind of was a foundation to my interest in the environmental visualizations class with Professor Bakshi, where we focused on the Superfund site at Newtown Creek and met with the Newtown Creek Alliance and really got to talk about the future of the site. So for the final project for this class, we produced a more imaginative representation of the creek using 360 cameras and collaging techniques in video editing. So these are a few screenshots from the project that we uploaded to YouTube that we can then pan around in. So the images we created have different green interventions and structures along the site used for bird watching and farming, as well as oysters returning to the site and fungi remediation. And this is a really unique perspective to reimagine a space and think about remediation in the environment and possible new ways we interface with a shoreline that is inaccessible to its surroundings today. Another project that is related to mapping and data that I wanted to share is a class I took at Columbia while at Barnard. That was a cross-disciplinary seminar called Conflict Urbanism, Language Justice in New York City, taught by Laura Kurgan, who is the director at the Center for Spatial Research. And this introduced me to critical cartography methods and significant projects like Laura Kurgan's $1 Million Blocks. So in this class, similarly, we had different tutorials on QGIS, Excel, as well as readings about multilingual space, environmental justice, and linguistic human rights. In the final project, my case study was about networks of Polish immigrants in New York City, which I based on personal experience, as well as recording oral histories of neighbors that spoke to a larger experience of ethnic enclaves. And it was also published as an interactive website with different sections highlighted on the left side as you scroll down, and featured a series of mappings that I turned into gifts to illustrate the narrative of neighboring Polish people and their movements in the city. And currently I'm a graduate student at GSAP, where all of these experiences have been really useful for me, and where I'm using these mapping and representation skills for current projects. A future project that I've been thinking of for a while, and something that I can speak about later, where I'd like to develop my interest in mapping and the environment more, is a digital mapping of the Barnard greenhouse that could be accessible to people visiting the greenhouse and could have vital information about plant species, geographic origin, and how people have historically used certain plants for different practices of care. But I can get into that a little bit later.
Okay.
So thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Laura. That's really exciting to see all those different projects and the way you're continuing to do that work in your graduate studies. I hope you'll hear more about that soon. So welcome everyone. My name is Alicia Peaker. I'm the Associate Director of the Digital Humanities Center here at Barnard. And I have a few remarks to get us started today on this panel on sunsetting and preservation. So if you're anything like me, you didn't realize you should be thinking about the end of a project until you were well into your first big one. So over the years, I've come to recognize that talking early and often about the imagined lifespan and afterlife of a digital project helps us keep focused and make better decisions about what matters most, right? So whether that's students thinking critically or connecting to an audience or demonstrating facility with digital archives, whatever the goal is. So I've developed a practice of asking faculty with whom we collaborate, how long do you expect this project to live, and who will be using it during that time? Some of you on this call have had these conversations with me. So when the project reaches the end of its lifespan, we also ask, what do we want to carry forward into our individual and collective futures about this project? So it likely isn't every single web file or planning document or notes you've ever created, right? We ask sort of, what is the story we want to tell about it? What's worth the labor of preservation, right? So because preservation takes labor, it takes financial support, it takes technical expertise. So further, we know that every website we publish to the web, every file we upload consumes energy and contributes to climate change. So at the DHC, we seek to reduce the harm caused through our digital humanities work by thoughtfully directing our limited resources, and that again is environmental, labor, and financial, towards projects that sustain our communities. We think it's important to recognize when a project has come to the end of its digital life, to celebrate the labor and community built through the project, and to respectfully sunset its presence on the web. Course projects, on the other hand, are often ephemeral by design. They often privilege process and student learning over products. And when we think about analog course assignments, there's rarely an expectation that the project will have a purpose or active life beyond the course. So when assignments move into the digital realm, expectations can shift. And I think it's worth examining why that happens and bringing real attention to the lifespan of a course project as well. And I think we're going to be hearing about that a little bit more today. So I'm excited to hear from all of you about your projects, your hopes, your plans, your challenges, your failures, right? All of those things as we go today. So I'm going to just start us out with the first question. And I think, and I'll let you know the order in just a moment, but our first question is to tell us a little bit about your course and what you hoped your students would learn or experience, or in Laura's case, what you learned and experienced through the Barnard Teaches program. And I'm going to start with Kadambari, and then we'll go to Hillary, and then Laura, and then Elizabeth.
Thanks, Alicia, and thanks to all for organizing this. It's really nice to actually have this sort of a, kind of almost like a post, in architecture, we would call it post-occupancy, but I would say post, whatever we want to call it, post-learning from the learning that we're all doing here. I think you heard from Laura already, so I'll just keep my notes very, very brief. I think you got to hear a little bit about the course. The course was really focused on kind of complex environmental histories and futures, and how to really think about that in the context of very specific urban sites. So Laura showed Newtown Creek. We also considered Gowanus Canal. We considered Lower Manhattan. And one of the intentions was to both look at kind of long-term histories and futures, but also look at kind of events, catastrophic environmental events, or I would say climate events, such as Hurricane Sandy. And we're doing another iteration, of course, right now, which is also looking at Hurricane Ida. So looking at these kind of what you might call them short term. Of course, they're not short term, but they are, they have kind of longer timelines as to why these events occur, understanding kind of climate issues in that context, but really to combine those trajectories and students to really research them, reinterpret them, revisualize them, and try to really think about these sites in very, very specific kind of place-based ways. And the second goal was really to experiment with multimedia technologies and kind of graphics and architectural drawings, how to combine, kind of experiment, using 360 cameras or other film cameras, etc., and combine it with architectural representations and graphics, etc. So that was the other goal, especially with these kind of issues that are dynamic, the sites are very present. We see the transformations of the sites kind of very vividly, but what we don't see, how do we use media to communicate, to understand, to research kind of invisible or unseen things. So that really was the goal. And I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to say one last thing is that the 3 iterations of the course were very different. And part of it was also, the pandemic, etc. We can get into that, but I think the kind of basic kind of explorations and goals did remain somewhat similar, but the actual courses did, have kind of occur in very different ways. So I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
I'm next. Hi. So I'm Hillary Callahan, and I'm a botanist, and I also specialize in what's called ecological genetics. And I had a long-standing interest in and commitment to plant biodiversity, and I have, ever since coming to Barnard, gone all the way from sort of the genomics end of that, all the way through examining how plants can have very specific distributions across the planet, right? So you have some plants that are very cosmopolitan, some that are very endemic and very narrowly specialized. And that's a long-standing interest in biogeography. And when I was specifically kind of approached and encouraged, and then eventually, accepted into the Barnard Teaches program, and the generosity of being able to subsidize a new relationship with the New York Botanical Garden, that was kind of like the realization of something that I had wanted to do since the moment I accepted my job at Barnard, right? So I knew coming to Barnard that I was going to have the greenhouse, and I'd have a research program that would build on my existing expertise. But over the years, I was constantly seeing this growth in what's called digital natural history, right? So digital natural history is really looking at museum collections in natural history museums, whether it's insects or mammals or birds or plants. And some of the largest physical collections of those kinds are right here in New York at the American Museum of Natural History for animals, and at the New York Botanical Garden for plants. And I was long aware of that. And for many years, I would take one field trip to the New York Botanical Garden, and usually had to make a choice between whether we would do an indoor trip and go to the herbarium, which is their museum of preserved historical plant collections, or use something more with the living collections there, going to their forest that they have on site, or going to the conservatory where they have plants from all over the world living in a museum display environment. And what this allowed me to do was to kind of really open up a course where that place-based experience, which was usually just like a one-off visit in my previous courses, that would really become what the course was all about. Is that we went to the New York Botanical Garden, I think 5 times during the course for, and it was a lab course in biology, which by its very nature, so it wasn't an innovation, it was an existing framework where we would have a long meeting once a week for 3 to 5 hours. So that allowed us to have the time to make these visits to the site. And that was really, truly exciting. And the other reason why having this course, which really focused on plant biodiversity and on the whole plant side of it, right? All the genomic stuff never made it into the course. I teach that elsewhere in other courses, but everything from, seeds, plants, pressed plants, mapping of existing plant communities, mapping of historic locations of where plants were in the past, how plants were moved from one continent to the other with colonization. That can all now be explored using digital natural history. So I was well aware of that. I was always reading about that revolution, and it was really something I considered to be outside my field, outside my personal specialty. And what this participation in Barnard Teaches allowed me to do was to expand my expertise and to sort of jump into that new field. And, when I go to conferences, people do ask me all the time, they're like, do you still work on your little model organism genomics thing? And I'm like, yes, I do. But I have also been doing this global biodiversity and global biogeography work. And then what I want to also add is that the title of my class, Plants and Profits, the Global Power of Plants, that came about in part because of an additional support that I got for the Center from Science and Society at Columbia, which is another really wonderful interdisciplinary center. And they really support being sure to have non-science topics in science courses, and elsewhere in the curriculum to have science infused into say humanities or arts courses. So I really was able, I was always very curious about infusing the history of the world and the history of plants, and also the history of botany itself, infused into the teaching that I do. And I teach a course about plant diversity and plant evolution ever since I think 2000. And initially with my small grant from the CSS, I was like, oh, I'm just going to infuse the history into that. And then when I did Barnard Teaches, it was like, okay, now I'm actually going to teach a whole brand new course. And so we were able to sponsor a really wide range of student projects in the course, everything from, looking at books written by women such as Emily Gregory, or Mrs. Lincoln, or, there were a lot of active botanists in the field of botany in the 19th century, or, looking at our own herbarium, which we have right here in the biology department. And I also had students who wanted to look at, there was a big project on the trees of Central Park, which was really a wonderful collaboration. And so there were student projects that were great, and they never really quite made it onto a website. So I want to kind of say that was a weakness and a shortfall of the course. But one thing that Sarah Green put together for me, which I really embraced and loved the way that she put it, was that after teaching the course 2 years in a row in spring 2018, and then again in spring 2019, I opted not to teach it a third time, but to go all out to take the digital coding lessons and some of the project focus areas and infuse them into my existing lab course in plant diversity. And I want to shout out to Jared Meek, who is now a PhD student and has as a new grad student involved in the second year of my Plants and Profits class, and then also in that third transitional year when we were infusing it into an existing course. And I was super excited about that class because it was, I think, kind of exactly what Barnard Teaches wanted to do. Of course, the pandemic interfered. And I just want to close out by saying the publication of the Barnard Teaches is also, because there were 3 different student interns who worked on it with me during the summer, is something still pending. And my vision for publicizing it was less about having it be on a Barnard webpage and more about this being a publication or a series of publications in botanical journals that have a very avid interest and readership in exactly this kind of topic. So in digital natural history for plants, and in understanding the history of botany and the history of colonization through the lens of plant collections. And so that's still forthcoming.
Thanks so much, Hillary. Laura?
I think just to respond to Kanambari before, definitely learned map making techniques and have it be connected to a course that I was really interested in was really nice. And to be able to connect with like a larger archive of maps at the New York Public Library was amazing. And also just to be able to browse through other maps that we saw when we did a site visit. And I think the other part of what I learned in the course was to really experiment with different representation techniques. So as the 360 video, it was really interesting to kind of create this immersive experience for like future speculations of the site, which was like an alternative way to explore architecture and think about how we can experience this site in the future.
I think I'm next. I'm Elizabeth Hutchinson in art history, although I know most of you. And my course was called Exhibiting Inuit Sculpture. I'm offering it for the second time right now. I offered it for the first time last summer. And the main goal of the class was to get students to think about decolonizing methodologies for art exhibit curation. So really thinking about producing public displays of Indigenous art that incorporate various strategies of decolonization. And I have sort of three partners for this project because Columbia University had been gifted 10 Inuit sculptures about 5 years ago, and I had agreed to teach a seminar in which we would put those sculptures on display. So Art Properties at Columbia was a partner. The Brooklyn Museum was a partner, and I worked very closely with Nancy Rossoff, who's the curator of Indigenous Art of the Americas there. And then my third partnership is with Indigenous curators and scholars. So I was very grateful that Sarah let me pay artists, curators, and scholars to come and speak to class directly about their own expertise. And the end product was supposed to, in both cases, be a physical exhibit and a digital accompaniment for the physical exhibit, but due to COVID, we are only putting up a physical exhibit this time. But in both cases of curation, the strategies that I really wanted my students to learn were to think about what kind of context would be an appropriate context to create for the visitors to this exhibit, and how can we guide visitors to look closely and do formal analyses of the objects on display to come to a richer, more appropriate understanding of them. And we were able to do that in our digital exhibit using timeline and story maps, and I can talk more about that later. But for the physical exhibit, we will continue to have a website, as well as building in some digital links that will be available through QR codes in the exhibit, so that people can hear the Inuit language, so that they can gain perhaps video access to the sites where these works are being produced, or perhaps some of the acts of production of artists at work. It's still in progress. I'll just say one more thing about it, which is because of the pandemic, most art history students had not had in-person internships. And the most extraordinary aspect of this class both times has been taking students into the museum. The Brooklyn Museum and Art Properties have been incredibly generous of teaching the students how to actually handle the works themselves. So instead of just looking, they put on gloves and they were able to pick things up and turn them around and really examine them closely with magnifying glasses. And we had sessions with conservators and archivists, and as well as the curator and collections manager, so that they really learned. They could ask a lot of questions. And finally, I didn't mention this, but I should say, we talked a great deal about the ethics of even exhibiting this work, and also about repatriation and other strategies of repatriating both objects and knowledge. And so one of the most exciting aspects of this class is that our website is available to our Indigenous partners, and will be able to be viewed in Baffin Island by the makers, should they wish to, and they're our most important audience.
Thank you so much. Such rich and fascinating courses. Makes me want to be a student again. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, combine two questions here, and you can pick up sort of whatever pieces feel juicy to you right now. But we talked about this sort of ephemerality of courses. So maybe talking a little bit about what aspects of your courses you originally imagined to be preserved, and what you had planned to let go, and if anything changed over the course of the course. And related to that, sort of what unexpected challenges did you face in either keeping it going or letting it go, and who are your partners along the way, maybe to help with some of those challenges. So I think we'll change it just a little bit and do Katabari, Laura, Hillary, Elizabeth this time. And yeah, let's go ahead.
Wait, sorry, did you say I was first? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great, sure. No, happy to talk more about this. So, it's really interesting question, I think, about the way you framed it, like preservation and letting go sort of framework. I really kind of like that, but it does make me think about what we mean by preservation, right? Like are we just talking about just documenting everything, or some part of it? And is it digital, analog? I mean, it's such a rich, and there's so many possibilities, right? So, that's sort of something, to think about. And I think I also like the idea of letting go, because obviously not everything we do and our students do is so precious that we have to, somehow keep it, file it, document it, forever. But so that's sort of an interesting tension, obviously, about this. So I think for me, the main question is really, who is this for, right? The preservation, like who? So for me, I think it's important to perhaps think about, it's for other students, it's for us as teachers, because, this grant, especially Barnard Teaches, is really encouraging us to think in new ways, to design courses in new ways, to partner with organizations that we normally would not have opportunities to do that. So that aspect of it, for me, the process is really interesting to kind of, think about and hopefully learn from that, so that, other people can then, also hopefully build on it, develop it, etc. The other thing I want to say that, as we know, especially since what happened in the last 2 years, right? All these kind of unexpected, whatever, the pandemic, etc. I mean, that is a very, I don't want to say unique, because surely we have to be prepared for things happening again at this scale, etc. But it is a kind of a slice that's very, in a way, time specific, let's say. Right, so that kind of temporality of what happened last 3 years, I think, is really interesting to think about, especially for this project, because many of us who did teach this course, during we were teaching the second iteration of the course, when we went from physical to online, when we had to suddenly pivot. We thought we were going to have 2 weeks spring break, and we were all going to be back, and etc. We all know the kind of what happened, but to say in terms of the course, it did have an impact. So our intention for that course was to then go to, after spring break, we were going to go to the Gowanus Canal, and we had organized all these trips and things that we were going to do there. Of course, none of that happened. But what did happen, which was really interesting, suddenly the students were dispersed around the world. We had few international students in our class, or even, just even in the US, but they weren't not in New York anymore. And I think a couple of students did these really interesting kind of mapping projects about the pandemic and COVID and et cetera, so we kind of, I think the class split, couple of groups kept working on the Gowanus Canal, but more virtually, like whatever they can do with the web. And the other students, wanted to do something about their kind of recent kind of experience of what had happened. And one project especially really did address the kind of COVID and all that. So I thought, that is such a kind of a event that, it's a kind of an exceptional event, and it would be great to have some documentation that that's what happened. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Laura, would you mind?
I could just add that when I was taking the course, we connected with the Newtown Creek Alliance and our TA, Chester Doles, who's working on a similar project called Newtown Creek 2050. So I think part of like this question of preservation, maybe in a way these projects can evolve and like can work with the connections we've made during the course. So I know in my experience, I've like done other projects also in Newtown Creek outside of school, and had gotten to go to Newtown Creek Alliance events. So I think that was like a way in for other projects, and I don't know, it builds this like portfolio of how the creek evolves over time, similar to also like the shoreline project I was working on.
Yeah, I love that. The evolution, I think, is important there. Hillary?
Yeah, so I think the main thing I want to comment about is the centrality of the place of the New York Botanical Garden. And like I do feel like both the course and the timing of the sort of third iteration of the course as a hybrid between the full-on Barnard teaching and the sort of post-Barnard teaching transformation with the pandemic really gave such a full and rich understanding of how important digital technologies are to biodiversity science. And I think that opening up that whole, it's a new discipline, right? So it is a data science discipline. I had this catchphrase that I would say, botany was the original data science. And I used to say that kind of flippantly, like it's catchy and it's sort of branding, but I really think it has turned out to be absolutely the case. And so what students were most interested in for both their projects within the course, which I agree with Kadambari, some of them, they were all great learning experiences. They don't all need to be preserved. We had some students who made kind of a very whimsical short film in the greenhouse as part of their project. They never quite finished it. It doesn't even exist on YouTube. It was a really worthwhile project, but it never really quite came to full fruition. On the other side, we had a student who in 2018 single-handedly wanted to digitize the entire Barnard herbarium, and she didn't nearly get to that, but her presentation when we were having our final session with the partner institution at the New York Botanical Garden, she was able to present that to the central people, right? To our partner, we have a partner at the library at NYBG. They have their own Mellon-funded humanities project. The director of the herbarium was there. The VP of conservation was there. I mean, all the big shots were there. And there's actually been like a whole changeover in staffing at the New York Botanical Garden because of COVID and early retirements and new hires. And yet my relationship with them, that's kind of endured through there, which speaks to a combination of I already had pretty strong context there, but this course made it even stronger. And so, I really think of people like, all my interns have gone on to sort of different things, but I think the work that they did will be published and has really transformed how I think about the greenhouse. And I know Laura, like what Laura mentioned, I know she worked really closely with Nick Gershberg, who's our on-campus partner in the Ross Greenhouse. And Nick has like incredibly tight ties with his counterparts at the New York Botanical Garden. Again, for a combination of like, he has them on his own because he's brilliant and he's a great botanist, but they were strengthened by this relationship. And then, lastly, Livia Martinez, who was in my spring 2020 class, learning about herbarium specimens and everything. She wound up doing her senior year-long thesis project in the Eaton lab where Jared Meek works, working exclusively with digital herbarium specimens. And I think she also worked with some physical herbarium specimens, but was very fluent in both of those things, and just did this incredible project that had to do with the physical flowers and theory about how they interact with insects. And she now has a career as a data scientist. So that really was the kind of thing that, students are doing projects, and their projects may be kind of humble, maybe flawed, maybe ephemeral. But what's enduring is that it's really like just reconfiguring the perspective of the students in the class on things that at one point may have seemed like really esoteric, boring, just nerdy, suddenly become like extremely vivid and extremely meaningful. So
wonderful. Elizabeth?
So I've been doing digital projects in my classes for many years, and I've always had a kind of lab attitude towards them, that they're opportunities for experimentation and risk-taking, and I have never thought about preserving those projects after the class ends, partially because my students have a variety of attitudes towards the towards that act. This is a really interesting question for me, but I will say that a couple of things. First, for this project, actually this semester, we are creating a permanent record of the student work, and we're actually creating it analog. So I've gotten the opportunity to create a threefold pamphlet that will capture the student work and be a kind of souvenir that they can take with them. And that visitors to the exhibit, which by the way is going to be in Low Library, and it's going to be installed on May 2nd, and it should be up through Christmas. So you will all be able, should Low Library become accessible to the public, but we're really counting on that at some point, you'll be able to see it. And hopefully, if the custodians don't throw them all away, you'll be able to take away your own souvenir from this project. And we thought that made sense as being durable forever, and not taking up a lot of space on a server or in someone's files. The second thing that I would say is I really want to echo Laura. I think that the majority of our graduates who do anything art related, of our majors in studio art or art history, do something in museums and galleries. And so the knowledge that they've gotten about being more thoughtful in their acts of handling objects and participating in exhibitions and promotion of exhibitions, I think will pay out in the internships. We have one intern serving right now who's working on a repatriation project with the Hopi Nation at the Brooklyn Museum, and we'll have 3 additional interns over the summer working in curatorial departments. And so hopefully they'll take that knowledge, and this will be a baseline for future work for them. Finally, I really do want to say that, I think my project's a little bit different from the others being discussed here because it's a curatorial project. The things that we are working with already exist and will already last. They are, physical sculptures, and the things that my students are gathering together as the context and interpretive materials, both on the web and through the QR codes in the physical exhibit, also already exist. And so for me, preservation might be less of a consideration than the ethical use of these objects. So I want to shout out to Meredith Wisner and Alana Altman, who are on the call, as people who've really helped the students think through proper crediting, accessibility, and really making sure that these pieces of these products of other people that we are gathering together to create new narratives are things that people can pursue and have access to if they want to deepen their knowledge of the subjects.
Thank you all so much for this. I want to open it up to see if there are other questions, and we're a small enough group. If you'd like, you can unmute or you can ask a question in the chat. So I will pause there to see if we have any questions for the panel.
I have a question. Did any of you all, of the professors, have conversations with your partners about preservations and what they wanted to see happen? Or your students too?
Kari, I'll comment to that because so the Humanities Institute at the New York Botanical Garden was and is running in parallel to Barnard Teaches and is like also a Mellon-funded project that focuses on texts and the digitization of text and also on digital exhibition. And so Vanessa Sellers, who was one of my major contacts at the New York Botanical Garden, she has senior fellows who work there, usually for a year, who are usually at the graduate or postdoctoral or early career academic stage. And some of those fellows have made like really elaborate digital exhibits. And she and I talked about those. And when I looked at how elaborate they were, I was just kind of like, well, I don't think we'll ever get to that level. And so I think our short, like 1 semester undergraduate group projects were never going to, want to reside side by side with the work she was doing. And I would also add, and I put in the chat, echoing what Elizabeth said, I think the partners, like what the New York Botanical Garden was most interested in was not the digital creations, but the sort of resurrection of physical art objects that we have at Barnard. So the Barnard Ross greenhouse is now so on the New York Botanical Garden's radar. And the herbarium collection that we have here in the biology department, very much something that NYBG is like, you guys need to, professionalize that and make it digitally accessible the way every herbarium in the world is now making itself digitally available. So not so much the projects, but like Elizabeth was saying, the central collections that these courses have focused on and the place and object-based aspects of the course have been really more interesting to the partners.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I just want to take a slightly different tack at Kari's question and say, when my son was in elementary school, I was bemused that his teachers always made them publish every bit of work that they did because they said they got 10% more out of them if they, had a reading of their work or if they, put something between covers. And I have noticed that when students make a digital project, it has a publicness that feels really different than a paper, and it can make them really work harder. And of course, they want the URL to share, so, even though it doesn't last forever, they want their family and friends to listen to their podcast or visit their story map. And so I think that is it's different in many ways, but it's very incentivizing, I think, particularly in the humanities classroom. I know in the sciences, the students do often go to conferences and things like that or co-publish with their professors, but our students don't tend to have those opportunities.
Kadambari?
I think Mark had a question. Mark, why don't you go first? It'll be good to hear from you. Yeah.
Sure. I have a slightly different question, so I don't know if you want to go ahead if you're responding to Kari.
Sure, I'll just do a very, very quick. Kari, in terms of your question, it's very timely for us because we're doing an iteration of the class right now that I'm teaching with Meg McLagan, who's in film. So it's become an architecture film course, and our partner is Union Docs Documentary Center. And they, we were just going to have this conversation with them they're coming to see the final projects for our students, which, by the way, on April 28th, we hope they will be shown in the movement lab, and they'll be also part of our exhibit on May 5th, which is the architecture exhibit. So any of you are please, welcome. But I think this is the conversation we're going to have with them very soon. So I think, we'll report back. Let me say that.
Great, thanks. Mark?
Thanks, everybody. These are really fascinating projects. When we're talking about preservation, one way to get that, I think, is maybe talking about capacity building. And so I'm wondering what people are thinking about how this project has enhanced Barnard's capacity to do projects like this, build collaborations, build courses around collaboration, and how we might move those sorts of things forward once this grant is completed. And maybe that's really a question for another audience, but I'm just wondering what people
Well,
are
I'm
thinking.
also, it's a great question, Mark, and Alicia, maybe you can also chime in on that.
Yes, about, are you thinking about the grant specifically?
Just see, you're sort of have a view of how courses that use digital projects have changed over the past few years. I mean, I think obviously so do Hillary and Kadambari and Elizabeth, and to some degree Sarah has as well. So, all of you have a perspective on that.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from the faculty too about specifically the ways that the collaborations have built some institutional capacity for continuing or growing some of those relationships. I think that's really wonderful. And yeah, and I would say here at the DHC too, courses like this, right, that students get really excited about, drive more interest in sort of digital kinds of projects, which then we can use to sort of try and advocate for more resources, more staffing to help support and grow these kinds of really innovative and exciting partnerships. Yeah, Hillary.
I know Nick in the greenhouse, Nick and I mean, first of all, we were so grateful to how much interest and effort Laura put into working with Nick. And yet it's such a heavy lift that Nick's collection and Nick as a full-time member of the biology department, does a job that is so extensive, right? I mean, he literally fixes the plumbing and, takes care of the plants and has the scientific knowledge and does all the networking with New York Botanical Garden and trains and supervises, he does so many things that he's stretched very, 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 very thin. And one thing that came up, actually this came up with Kari and Mark in some grant writing that we did for the greenhouse, is that we don't have enough dedicated brain power in the greenhouse. We Nick is very busy with the physical work, so he has only a portion of his time for that brain power. And we have really thought about the greenhouse as another center, right? A center that's outside of Milstein, and really bringing it into the fold of digital humanities, of empirical reasoning, of the movement lab, of the media center. And I think that, the post-bac programs that Laura, Laura, you were one of the post-bacs at one point in time, maybe not, but the people who have done post-bacs in those various centers have also interacted with Nick. And we kind of dream of having a post-bac program that could be located in the greenhouse. And so that might be a pathway that's very Barnard oriented, Barnard centric, Barnard appropriate, and a way, a mechanism for building capacity. Because it really is the brain power and the expertise that at least in my discipline, that there just isn't enough. Students are going too much through a revolving door and too part-time. So having a post-bac, for 2 years would be transformative.
Thanks, Hillary. And we're going to hear from Elizabeth and Kadambari, but I'm also mindful of the time. And so I would actually just ask also the faculty who are on this panel. One of my questions was about next steps. So we heard about the exhibition opening. We heard about the film coming. So if you have links to share or information about that you want to drop in the chat as we're finishing up here for people to attend, that would be wonderful as well. So Elizabeth?
Great. We don't have an opening planned, but I will stay tuned. I'll try to alert you. But I just wanted to say that I think what was really extraordinary about this grant was that we helped our institution as well as our institution helping us. It really allowed me to partner with a less well-heeled institution in New York City than the ones that I frequently use for my art history classes, which are also geographically closer. But, you know, Barnard Teaches allowed this pretty neglected area of the collection of the Brooklyn Museum to come to light and be better known. We helped them conserve the pieces, and we help them photograph the pieces so that they have better ability to be made available to any researchers, whether they're coming through my site or through the Brooklyn Museum site. And that's true for the Columbia pieces as well, which are really important. Columbia's native collection is really not known in Native communities, and it needs to be so that they can come and do the work with their collections that they want to. But in both of those cases, these are not organizations that could have made that a priority on their own. And that's really what partnership means to me. And I would love to see more grants that allow me to build on a partnership with the Brooklyn Museum. But we would need to bring them things as well as ask things of them.
Thanks. Kadambari?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to add, in terms of building institutional capacity, I would say, Mark, to your question, that it actually built the faculty capacity to collaborate with organizations, to learn how to collaborate with, you know, kind of these cultural institutions and really take advantage of being in New York City in a way, you know, so that we always say we do that, but of course it, you know, when we are supported to do that with resources, that's a different level of using kind of New York City. So I definitely want to kind of echo some of that, what's been said earlier. The other thing, at least in our case, I would say what we also learned that, you know, collaborating with something like New York Public Library, MAC Division, it has been and is very different than something like Union Docs, which is a small film organization in Williamsburg. And they both, of course, have their advantages and disadvantages. You know, but I think we are learning how to do that. We are learning how to, you know, work with big organizations, what they have to offer, but also how to really, you know, get more in a way, or let's say, quote unquote, capitalize on that, you know, kind of resource. And I say that because as much as we love the MAP division, they really have an incredible collection. They curated a very special collection for us. It was amazing to see all these physically, like go to the map room, see, you know, all that worked very well. But beyond that, they were not really that engaged, I would say, in the class, that they just curated a collection. They made it available to the students. And, you know, but that I think is also the nature of the organization, right? New York Public Library is such a big, you know, kind of organization. Union Docs, on the other hand, has been really very much involved in the class. They've brought other artists to the class. They've done walking tours for us. We've done walking tours with the artists, etc. So it's a really different level of engagement. And I think that these semester-long courses really help us think about how we partner with organizations and how really to get, you know, make those relationships much more extensive than just like a visit to the museum, right? Or something like that. So
if I may too, I just want to kind of close this out, because if you go back to the very founding of Barnard, it coincided with the founding of many of these, like not the smaller institutions, which I think are important to recognize and think about, but when we think about the library, when we think about the New York Botanical Garden, they came into existence in the same couple of decades. And actually there was active participation and integration at those founding decades. And so it's actually really gratifying to be, you know, 130 years later, knitting these cultural institutions back together again with Barnard students and Barnard faculty. And it's kind of like even the same Mellon lineage. No, but I mean, it really is true. I mean, the Botanical Garden was founded 1 year after Barnard, and we're reciprocally both very aware of that. And I think the same is true for NYPL and some of the other museums.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This was such a invigorating conversation, and I love the sort of emphasis on relationships, right? That are being built and fostered through this grant. Sarah, is there anything else, or should I close it out?
Yeah, I can send out contact information to the people who are able to attend, just in case someone wanted to reach out to anyone on the panel. And I really appreciate everyone's words here today, participation, questions. This is really great. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Sarah, for your enduring support. You've always been amazing.
Thank you.